So, as stated, my name is Aman Nadhiri. I'm at Johnson C. Smith University, and I want to talk about, as you all can see, the religious milieu of the Antebellum South for the enslaved, and I'm going to be focusing a little more on the enslaved African Muslims, but I'm going to do a little more background, and to be honest, this is going to be a presentation where there are more questions than answers that come up, and I think that's not just because I didn't do the background, it's more because it's very hard to speak with any kind of real definitive sense about the experience of enslaved African Muslims in the Americas, in North America. So when we begin, we want to look at the origins of what are the quote-unquote contributing areas for people who ended up in the Americas and the United States in general. Because one of the things that separates, that you could say makes the North American experience unique, is the diversity of places from which enslaved Africans were brought. In the Caribbean, for instance, there was a diversity of places from which Africans were brought, but there tended to be more of a concentration of certain ethnic groups. So in the island of Jamaica and the island nation, you see a lot of people of Ghanaian ancestry. You know, even in Brazil, a large number of people from modern-day Nigeria end up in Brazil, a large proportion. But in the United States, almost all 7 areas. So the Senegambia, which is Senegal, the Gambia, and out until like the upper and middle Niger, right? Sierra Leone, which another area, Sierra Leone, which includes Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, and Ivory Coast as well, among others, right? The Gold Coast, which is basically Ghana. You have also, and we have to extend that out. You have the bottom of Benin, which is Benin River, which is around southwestern Nigeria, and kind of Benin, this area right here. You have the Bight of Biafra, which will then include to these areas. You have what we would call West Central Africa, which would really be this area, Congo and Angola, and you even have Mozambique, Madagascar, and parts of Tanzania, a very small percentage. Right? So these are your 7 areas that contribute to the enslaved population of North America. And of course, you have to put contribute in air quotes because, of course, did not contribute to it, right? When we talk about the concentration of percentages, and these are the percentages of enslaved Africans, or the percentages of the total, right? So the Senegambia, 14.5%. You can see Sierra Leone, 15.8%. Gold Coast, 13.1%. Bada Benin, 4.3%. Interestingly, if you look at the Bada Biafra and West Central Africa, you see that they account for almost 50% of all enslaved Africans brought to the United States. Right? So a large percentage. And we assume that Madagascar, parts of Tanzania, and Mozambique would have been the remaining 1.8%. Now, of this population, right, now, the traditions that would have been present, and in one sense you could call them religious traditions, in another you could call them spiritual traditions, and another you could even call them kind of ways of knowing. But you have, of course, the quote-unquote traditional religions, and in part we call them that, or I call them that because, because I can't give you, there are a plurality of religions that are practiced, or a plurality of beliefs that often incorporate animist, pantheistic, and polytheistic belief systems. And also there tends to be an element of ancestral veneration also. You also have Islam that's present, and you also have, to a smaller extent, Christianity, and this is mainly in the West Central Africa region, the areas of modern-day Congo and Angola, and this comes in large part because the Portuguese had been active in the area from the 15th century. So there had been a degree of missionary activity, or that it resulted in a percentage of the Congolese and Angolans actually being Christian, and of course practicing Catholicism, those who practice. Now, when we talk about enslaved African Muslims, the contributing areas of note would be Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the areas of Senegambia, Sierra Leone, Gold Coast, the Bada Benin, and the Bada Biafra. These would be areas with a Muslim presence. So basically everywhere except for Congo and Angola would have contributed in that sense. Now, before I go on, when I was thinking about this topic and working on it, something that came up was some of the paradigms that we often, or the ways of understanding when we talk about African Muslims. Oftentimes, in my view, right, so the perspective, we come across the idea of, are they Muslim or are they African? Are they mostly Muslims who are Africans, or are they Africans who are Muslim? And even in the term Muslim African or African Muslim, the word that comes first kind of gives some indication of where the emphasis will be. And I think that it's problematic in the sense that we're not really understanding the true complexity, or we're not acknowledging the true complexity of the situation. And I think it's an issue that happens in discussing African peoples and societies in general. And so in either instance, we're marginalizing one aspect. So and you could argue that or I would argue there's no real nuanced understanding of African Muslims. And I would also argue that there's no real understanding of just Africans in general, because either we are marginalizing their experience as Muslims or marginalizing their experience as Africans, which is equally problematic. And so if we take the paradigm of civilization, right, so then there are Muslim Africans. Muslim, members of a world civilization that deserves respect. Right? And I'm not saying that this is my opinion, I'm saying this is how it's often interpreted. African, backward, uncivilized. So Muslim Africans are deserving of respect to the extent that they are participants in this world religion. However, their Africanness often is understood to dilute this process, right? So as a result, Muslim Africans, we see syncretism, right? This idea of syncretism, which is interesting in the sense that almost any people who adopt a religion are going to not blend it, but respect the parts of their cultures and their previous states and ways of knowing that do not directly conflict with that religion. So for instance, growing up in Central Florida, I grew up in largely South Asian communities, what we would call Desi communities, from the Indian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And we all knew when it was time to make salah, when we prayed. But they also knew when it was time to make namaz, right? And so I grew up hearing people say, are you making namaz? Did you make namaz? I didn't understand. I knew it meant praying, but then one day I was at a yoga studio and someone said namaste, and I thought, oh, okay, now I understand, right? So that's not syncretism, right? That's using a word, because namaz in Sanskrit means to bow with obeisance, right? When you're praying, you often are bowing and making obeisance. So it's a way of understanding, right? It's a previous way of knowing that fits into a new way of knowing. But when it comes to African Islam, we often, in this civilizational paradigm, we see any quote-unquote Africanisms as adulterating what is true Islam. Again, true Islam in air quotes. Under the paradigm of authenticity, then an African is a bearer of authentic traditional African ways of knowing, culture. And a Muslim is an adherent of a foreign, a Near Eastern religion that's not consonant with African belief systems or values, cultures. And an African Muslim is authentic to the degree that she or he Africanizes Islam, which apparently in this paradigm is a process that is unlike any other process that happens in the issue of world religions, right? And Muslim, and although she or he is African to that extent, unfortunately as a Muslim, they're also a colonized subject, right? That they now adhere to a thoroughly non-African religion. And of course the issue in both of this is that it denies agency to African Muslims or Muslim Africans. You know, that they are in each case a passive spectator, a passive recipient of some other ideology, that their culture is only strong enough in complete isolation. And it reminds me of a funny story when I was actually getting into African history a little more. It was a story of the Almoravid conquest of Ghana that happened around 1076. And it's a funny story because as I started to read more recent scholarship, you know, the older scholarship was very confident that the Almoravids had conquered Ghana in 1076. But apparently around the 60s or 70s, it turned out they never did. You know, and the main impetus for this was just a reevaluation of Africans' roles in the world. And so the liberation movements in Africa, suddenly the idea that lighter-skinned peoples from the north conquered darker-skinned peoples from the south did not hold water as much. So it led to a whole reimagination or new approach to the situation, or to what we thought was settled historical narrative. But to move on to the idea of these areas, if you recall, are areas with significant with a Muslim presence, right? The Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, these large regional configurations, the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra. When we talk about a Muslim population or a Muslim presence, they can be understood as existing in several forms. So one form is a society in which Islam is a dominant belief system and mode of religious expression, a la Fuda Toro, the Hausa city-states, a lot of northern Nigeria, to give some examples. Another would be a society in which Islam is one of several prominent belief systems and a widely recognized mode of religious expression. So it's widely understood, widely known, but it is not the dominant system in the mode of again, Fuda Toro, for instance. And another example would be a society or societies in which Islam is a minor belief system in terms of numbers. Perhaps a religion of a traveling merchant class. Here, the Jula or the Wangara come to mind, those Soninke merchants that worked their way down West Africa and into Nigeria, all the way down to Ghana. So it's a minor belief system in terms of numbers, and a society in which another belief system or systems is dominant. But it still enjoys a level of recognition as a mode of religious expression. So it is not the dominant, or even doesn't enjoy a plurality or straight domination, but it is still recognized and understood, if not practiced by the majority of people. So as such, an individual from a society with a Muslim presence could either adhere to Islam as a sole belief system and mode of religious expression, could honor more than one belief system, including Islam, using all of them as modes of religious expression. And when I say honor more than one belief system, this is where it used to be called syncretism, right? And the idea was that people are blending religions, that they take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And my argument would be that people are not blending religious systems, that they are not mixing mildly, that they are practicing, they're honoring these religious systems, these belief systems at different times. You know, if we read the story of Sunjata, you know, he sacrifices to jinns, to other deities, but he appears in Muslim garb. And he is not sacrificing to jinns while he is in quote-unquote Muslim garb. You know, one can go to a mosque or a masjid and go to a church and not attempt to make a Muslim prayer in the church or take Eucharist in a mosque, right? That people can be aware of different different belief systems and honor them. And oftentimes, what we see is that it is done, well, we'll get to that, right? So, or someone could adhere primarily to another belief system, but occasionally participate in communal Islamic modes of religious expression, such as, community prayers, celebrations, right? Maybe someone who is non-Muslim goes to Tabaski, right? Goes to Eid al-Adha, something like that, right? Or to utilize Islamic symbols, etc., that are identified as efficacious. For instance, objects that contain written Quranic passages, right? Something that is seen as, even if they are not engaging with Islam as a dominant mode of religious expression, that yet they might see something as efficacious. And even if you read accounts of crusades, there are instances in which people in the Levant, Muslims will take their children to be baptized because it's seen as efficacious. Right? So this is something that we see in many different societies. You know what? Yes?
Could I give a quick example?
Sure.
This reminds me of what happens in Philadelphia. That people talk about the Sunnah beard, they talk about men who are wearing what looks like to be Muslim garb, but they're not Muslim. But they're also giving people the greeting, right? They're using inshallah, but it's because it's so much a part of the culture of Philadelphia, right, that people engage in it, knowing that they're not professing to be Muslim or a practicer of Islam.
There's a very famous radio personality in a breakfast club who calls himself, a God who has never been a part of the Nation of Islam, the 5% Nation, or anything like that. So some of these things they take on cultural meaning. So our current mode, when we look historically at identifying people who are Muslims, actually could be more correctly understood as identifying what we call practicing Muslims. People who pray, read, what have you. But it fails to acknowledge the large number, and I didn't want to say majority because I didn't want to step on any toes, but we'll just call it a large number of people who self-identify as Muslim, but who are not what they might identify as practicing Muslims. I didn't want to say cultural Muslims, although the term might fit, but basically people who live within that, who have who are self-identified as Muslim, and perhaps participate in certain activities like fasting, what have you, but do not practice per se, or are not, in a daily practice. And the same thing is, we see the same phenomenon in other religions also. People who go to church for Christmas and Easter, something like that. But we don't have a way of identifying these numbers of people because oftentimes they do not stand out enough to be recognized, especially in the situation in which they find it, right? So, to take it to the antebellum South, among the enslaved, you of course seen the presence of traditional religions, Islam and Christianity, right? And they all would have existed. Right? They would have been maintained, and to the extent possible, depending on the circumstances on the ground, depending on where you are enslaved, to whom you are enslaved, what that person's ideology or religious belief is, what their ideology toward controlling enslaved people. They would have been maintained and practiced to the extent where that's possible, but both socially subordinated to Europeanized Christianity, whether Catholicism in places like Louisiana or Protestantism that was practiced by the enslaving class. Meaning that to the extent that these beliefs could be maintained and practiced, they would never be practiced to the extent that they would never enjoy the social position, the dominant position that they had in their previous societies. It would always be kind of subordinated. In the case of Islam, that would be problematic, not necessarily as much for the people who were brought, but the people who were born into it, because like all world religions, there is a need for infrastructure to teach the succeeding generations. So, For enslaved Muslims, and operationally, this would mean that their ability to practice their Muslim identity through practice, prayer, fasting, dhikr, so remembrance, etc., would vary in relation to the disposition of the enslaver vis-a-vis cultural and religious expression among the enslaved, as well as the degree to which his or her practice of Islam, or his practice of Islam was recognized as religious, as opposed to cultural or ethnic. Because there are ethnic groups that were associated with Islam, the Pular, the Fulani in particular, right, were recognized by those who knew as Muslims. However, other ethnic groups may not have been recognized to that same extent. You know, I'm not sure to the extent to which, say, the Mandinka or the Soninke were recognized, although the Soninke are the elder statesmen of Islam in West Africa. They, and you could say the certain Berber, like the Sanhaja among the Berber, they are the elder statesmen. You know, to this day, some word from Muslim is a Soninke word. It has a Soninke root. So they are the elder statesmen, but yet within this context, they may not have been recognized as Muslim in the same way that the Fulani were. And so to the extent that someone recognized it as a religious practice or an ethnic or cultural expression might then determine whether even someone who might have been amenable to practicing Islam might not have been amenable to what they thought was just like an African practice. And again, that also comes in terms of using words that are Arabic in origin versus maybe words that are local words, things of that nature. So, in the end, we can't really quantify the number of people of enslaved African Muslims because there was no uniformity in the circumstances of the enslaved, right? If there's no uniformity, there's not a uniform way in which someone can self-identify. So, in each situation of enslavement, most likely a variety of factors dictated whether an individual, Muslim or non-Muslim, instrumentalized her or his ethnic, religious, or class/vocational identity to improve her or his conditions. If it was more befitting, if it behooved someone to stress their ethnic identity more, then that probably would have happened. Religious identity more, that probably would have happened. And anyone who has grown up in or around an immigrant community will know that oftentimes that someone may leave a certain situation not a practicing member of a religion and then go to another place where suddenly that religion becomes a central part of their identity, or the easiest way to maintain a connection to their past, to their identity, and suddenly non-practicing Muslims and Christians become strict practicing Muslims when they come to the United States, or the other way around. You know that it depends on, too much of this depends on individual circumstances. And when we factor in the idea also of people who are not strictly practicing, right? And when we ask also, when we realize that how someone self-identifies is equally important and more important than how someone else identifies. Because when we're looking at the record, we're looking at non-African, non-Muslims often making a judgment on is this person, what stands out about this person to them at the time. And it's interesting because even in a West African context, when you see the jihads of like the 18th century and beyond, many of these are led by clerics by and large. And the clerics are not calling out many of the rulers for quote-unquote syncretism. They're calling them out for enslaving and selling Muslims to non-Muslims. This is the principal issue that they have. So these are clerics, and I raise that point. They say that usually these are people who are, as we would say, in the know. And if they're not calling it, if their problem is the behavior of kings, specifically enslaving other Muslims and selling them, then it gives you a sense of kind of the social conditions, right? That in many societies, the clerics formed a kind of caste almost. And so the expression of certain types of religious knowledge was left to them because that was their, you could almost say, their lane in society. And so when we add all these factors together, it becomes very difficult to give a specific example, to give a real sense and a real number of what the condition, what the number of enslaved Muslims were. You know, and even their relation to one another, because that's not something that's given particular attention. You know, we see a couple of examples where a Muslim may have said something about non-Muslim Africans in a derogatory way, but it's said to the enslaver. So they may have been trying to establish some separation, in treatment. Maybe they're responding to what they thought. They're giving someone something that they think is going to improve their situation. So at best, we can use the circumstantial evidence, areas of origin, recorded birth names, right, artifacts that we may find to construct a generalized picture, adding to it the understanding that all enslaved Africans, Muslim, including enslaved Muslims, use all the tools at their disposal to express their religious, ethnic, and cultural identities as part of the larger work of privileging their humanity over their current circumstances.